Greetings and welcome. We are in AP English, and our objective for the hour now is to introduce to you the next epoch in British literature that we call the Romantic period. Now, set aside any notions of love vis-a-vis romance and romantic, okay? We're not talking about that at all, okay? I mean, we already know that guys and girls have been doing this thing for a long time, long before the magic date of 1800. I'll be on the whiteboard now. Watch this for a second, just to remind, okay? Remember, we kind of look at history and we play this game of this timeline, right, where we put the birth of Christ. We talk about events which are before the Common Era, events that are Common Era, right? We put out here 399 is the death of who? Death of Socrates, right? 200 roughly, Rome begins their thing. 410, Rome will fall. And then we just kind of work down this timeline. Let's go over where we've been in regards to English literary texts, using round dates to make them easy for ourselves. 1000 Common Era is the text Beowulf, remember? Then we'll work with 1350 for Chaucer, you'll recall. Then we'll call 1600 the Renaissance and Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? Hopefully, as I kind of continue to go over these dates, you start to lock them in your brain. So when you hear 1600, you immediately at least can think about Shakespeare's Hamlet, the English Renaissance, etc. 1700, last week I lectured on the Enlightenment. We talked Bacon, we talked Pope, we talked Swift, let's all eat our kids and all of that. That we call the Scientific Enlightenment. Can I just say SE and you'll understand what that means, the Scientific Enlightenment. We now come to 1800. So here we go. We now come to 1800. Now the way to read this chart on page 781, and this will make total sense to you now. The way to read this chart on 781, watch my whiteboard and this will make total sense. On that chart, there is a phrase, neoclassical. Do you see it? Neoclassical. I'll circle scientific enlightenment and put neoclassical, and now you understand. You got me? Okay, so we're basically talking about that time period of the scientific enlightenment, and another phrase for it is neoclassical thinking, okay? And if you look at the chart on 781, you'll see right away that it makes sense. I mean, dude, if you're interested in the scientific method, obviously you're going to stress reason, common sense, and on and on and on it goes. On the opposite side of the chart, the introduction of what we will call romantic writers, romanticism. Now, our first objective this hour is to define what that means. Our second objective is to be introduced to the first great of our romantic writers, Wordsworth. Okay? And then finally, we'll start to look at his classic text, Tintern Abbey. Let's define romanticism real quick. These movements are like a pendulum on a clock that swing back and forth, and back and forth, okay? Between, oftentimes, extremes, we might say, okay? So, for example, watch my whiteboard, see how this works. For roughly that 1,000 years, we call that the Dark Ages, correct? Then we talk about this as the Renaissance or the Light Ages, right? The Light Ages is another way to think about it. Then you've got the Scientific Enlightenment itself, okay? And now Romanticism. That pendulum movement, back and forth and back and forth. The Romantic age is a reactionary age. It is a reaction to what? Well, to the age that preceded it. What preceded it? The age of reason, the age of science, the age of neoclassical thought. Okay. An easy way to kind of think about this is the age of Romanticism, and you already know this because we were juniors last year and we studied Tommy and his pals writing, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. We call that the Declaration of what? Independence, and it was penned supposedly in what year? See, watch the whiteboard, it makes sense, right? 1776, right? Almost 1800. We like to think of Romanticism as the age of revolution. Well, I've already referenced one, so you can write that one quickly down in your notes. What's one obvious revolution? Well, we mentioned it, 1776, the American Revolution. Of course, we won't forget that the American Revolution and the French Revolution come very close together, correct? So we want to give some energies to the French Revolution, mention that in our notes. But there's a third revolution that we're also going to mention.
Von Swan.
No, this one's not going to be a revolution that's specific to a country. Anyone want to prove that they've been reading already?
Neoclassicism?
No, classical, the revolution of science, we already talked about. But I'm speaking of a different revolution now. There's the American Revolution, the French Revolution. There's a third revolution, but it's not a country. That should be a hint for those of you. It is the Industrial Revolution. That's it. Write it down. It's the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'm going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, but more in the abstract. I'm going to talk about it in specifics when I talk about that time in English history that we call the Victorian period, okay? So I'll speak more definitively about that here in a bit, all right? In a week or so, a couple of weeks. Now let's talk about the age of Romanticism. When we move from the Renaissance in 1600 to that age of reason, that 100 years roughly or so, 150 years, from 1600 to 1800, science takes over. It produces the most important academic work is done in science. And it produces the great minds. We think of them, don't we, of Newton and Galileo, and the list is prodigious and important, isn't it? But there becomes a moment when thinkers begin to work backwards instead of forwards. And they begin to think about an earlier time when everything seemed to be better than it is now. Okay? When Socrates is doing his thing, and we know, of course, through Plato's great dialogue Republic, we know that one of the central questions was this question of, remember it, human nature. Remember this? And the question of human nature, remember, is easily kind of divisible by this really simple sophomoric kind of understanding of, on the one hand, humans as being inherently bad, evil, remember, fallen, right? If we're talking John Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? And then on the other side, humans as inherently good, divine, right? Corrupted, remember, by a bad society or a poor education. Let's go ahead now and say it. Neoclassical writers predominantly favored this view of human nature. A view of human nature that saw humans as somewhat kind of fallen, screwed up, etc. We will call the Romantic view a view that holds specifically to the inherent divinity, goodness of the human species. Okay? The reason is because of our two boxes, remember, from Platonic theory, right? Where on the one hand we had the images, and on the other hand we had what Plato called the forms. We call them concepts. We call them ideas. Do you remember this? For those of you, of course, who loved your reading of Emerson and Thoreau last year, sorry to give you a flashback, the one thing you will recall about Emerson and Thoreau is their dates. Right? And guess where we are? Bingo. Okay? So while Romanticism is happening in England, Transcendentalism is happening in America. Got me? So you're going to have the same kind of game getting played on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, what is this Romantic Revolution? Well, if you'll go back to our two-box theory, remember we can talk about the beautiful body, right? Right? You remember this, so the beautiful face. And then we can talk over here about beauty itself. Remember, as a concept, you can't really touch beauty. You can only, right, think about it. And we could go on with this project, correct? Remember, we talked about Ruthie's tree out there in that courtyard. You can see, touch, taste it, other related to the five senses. We'll not get into detail. But then on the other side, you can talk about Ruthie's tree as being evidence of nature or energy, right? Okay? And remember, we can talk about the same thing in regards to a human body. So we can talk about a human body in the first box. We can talk about the human soul, if you want to use the Phaedo, the language of the Phaedo, Plato's great dialogue about soul, in the second box. Now I can say it this way, and it's very simple. Remember, we said it this way last year when we talked about transcendentalism. To transcend means to go beyond. To transcend, go beyond the first box to the second box. That's transcendentalism. That's also romanticism. See how easy I can do that now? Romantics are very interested in that second box. Far more than the first box. They will use, another way to say this, use the first box to get to the second box. Okay? But what they're really interested in are those things, those elements of the second box. Well, now you can look at this chart on 781 and it starts to make some sense. They're going to stress emotion and imagination. They're going to write about subjective experiences of especially the individual. That third one is the key. They're going to exalt nature, capital N, as being central. Emerson will, of course, write his most classic essay is, in fact, called Nature with a capital N, right? Okay. Of course, this notion of the spontaneity of thought is going to also be crucial, and we'll get into that when we start to talk about Wordsworth himself. Now, let's talk about Wordsworth. The Romantic writers divide, for your notes, the Romantic writers divide into two groups. We call them Generation 1, Generation 2. I like to call them the Generation 1 as the old farts and the Generation 2 as the young hellions, for reasons that will become totally clear to you as we get into this literature, all right? The old farts, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake, Burns. The old farts, Generation 1, led especially by Wordsworth. Wordsworth is the great, in many ways, classical romantic thinker of the English period, okay? Second generation of the young hellions of Byron, Shelley, Keats. We'll even study them in that order. Byron, Shelley, Keats. All three of them die young. All three of them live a pretty intense life and then die very young, okay? And we'll obviously talk about the comparisons to other kinds of genius we think of artists, musicians, in our own time period. Immediately, obviously, although a little past your time now, Kurt Cobain comes to mind. Of course, Jimi Hendrix comes to mind. Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, comes to mind. Janis Joplin. All of those artists that I just named of the 20th century have in common one thing. They burn the candle really bright, and then they die. Self-inflicted, usually, either outright or indirectly through drugs, alcohol. We will find some similarities between the second generation romantics. Are you ready for this? The great Jim Morrison, the lead singer for The Doors, carried around in his back pocket for most of his adult life a crumpled up old volume of the poetry of Lord Byron. No kidding. He just carried it in his back pocket as inspiration. Well, once we talk about the Byronic hero and Lord Byron, you'll understand a little bit better why he did that. But before we get to Generation 2, let's spend time with Generation 1. And let's talk about who is the one that kind of in many ways kickstarts a new way of thinking about poetry especially. And his name is Wordsworth. Now, some have said because his name involves the word words that there has to be some expectation that he would be a word master of sorts. It's not that easy. And yet in some ways it is kind of that easy. Wordsworth is prolific. He is prodigious in the amount of lines of poetry that he will write. We'll look at Tintern Abbey and we'll see it as an example. In 1800, this is an easy date to remember, Wordsworth is working on a very important collection of poems called Lyrical Balance. That is a title you want in your notes. Lyrical Balance. Now, today, if you listen to a song and you read the lyrics, you're reading what? The words of the song, correct? That's how we use the word lyric today, correct? Lyrical here will mean short and melodic. Ballad is another word for poem or song. Okay? Lyrical Ballads. Published and immediately sells out. I mean, people are like, whoa, what is this? By the way, if you have a first edition of Lyrical Ballads, and there aren't very many around, I've only seen one in my life, it's worth thousands of dollars. They're collected now, okay? Because there weren't very many of them published, and they sold really quickly. Wordsworth wrote this with Coleridge. They wrote it together, another important Generation 1 poet that we'll talk about next week. After they sell out, they decide to republish or reprint Lyrical Balance again. Only this time, Wordsworth decides to answer a really interesting question. Dude, what is different about this poetry? Okay? Now, let's point out, romantic types don't often like that question. In fact, we know that Cobain loathed that question in interviews. When people asked him about what was going on with Nirvana, he would just say, if you don't get it, I'm explaining it to you. But Wordsworth decides to try to explain it. The best example of this, since I've mentioned Cobain, is I remember vividly the morning back in the back of 303, I heard two students and they were arguing out loud. And one of them said it isn't music, and the other one said it is music. And I was interested to know what it was we were arguing about, what's music, what's not music. Oh, a new CD that was just released yesterday by a band, one of the students says to me, by a band, a new band named Nirvana. And one of the students said, that is not music. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but it isn't music. And the other student said, no, it's just different from the kinds of music that came before. And of course, Nirvana's very first album was a groundbreaking landmark album. Of course, today, and you know, you guys can look at me and roll your eyes now because it's obviously old fart music that gets played in elevators. But for its day, when it first was released, that album was a monumental shift on the landscape of music. There were people who said it wasn't music at all. It didn't sound like music. It didn't look like music. The same is true for Lyrical Ballads. The only difference is that Wordsworth elects to write a brief essay called the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1802, on the reprint, where he outlines the specifics of this poetry that he's writing. So, for example, in this collection of poetry, there's a little poem that goes something like this. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. I get really happy when I see rainbows. So was it when my life began? When I was a kid, I loved rainbows. So is it now I am a man? So be it when I shall grow old or let me die. An old man says, if I ever get to the point that I look at rainbows and I don't get really giddy, I just hope somebody puts a bullet in me. Well, that seems a bit extreme. Oh no, there's still one more line to the poem. The child is father of the man. And I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. The child is father of the man? Lines that maybe you'll remember once long ago in your biography you wrestled with. What do those words mean? We understand when we say the father is the father to the child, but how can a child be the father to the man? Well, it's like one student reported as a senior, she said, I think I understand that line because I'm just a few days from graduating and my ma is not handling it very well. And all of a sudden it occurs to me this strange reality that Wordsworth's talking about, the child is father to the man. Our parents raise us to a certain point and then we turn around and raise them. And a number of my seniors went, whoa, that's kind of true. There are certain things that your parents can only understand by virtue of you. You have to teach it to them. They don't know everything. For example, they don't know what it's like to sit next May, coming in a few days, and watch you graduate. They can imagine it, but you are the key to them understanding what that is like, and only you. See, you are the father to them. You are the parent to them. Wordsworth will point out there are things children can teach parents that can only be learned by adults from kids. This is a very romantic idea. So to explain this poetry, he writes this preface where he says a few things. By the way, these are called the Principles of Lyrical Ballads. I believe you've got some information here starting on page 780 to 781. They're there as bullet-pointed work. I'm kind of working off the assumption you've already looked at this intel on 780 to 781. They're a new concept in poetry, spontaneity and freedom, a love of nature, the importance of the commonplace. All of these are going to be essenced in this notion of what it means in lyrical ballads to write romantically. Recollections is an important word. The romantic writers will like to go back and to recollect. They like to have experiences, and then they like to write about those experiences when they have recollected about them in, the key word for Wordsworth is tranquility. That is to say, peace. So, for example, it's going to be a time of sitting, quiet. Wordsworth is a classic example of this. He loves to go on these what are called walking tours, where he'll walk for a day, and then he'll come to a nice little cottage hotel, and then he'll get a room, and then he'll go out in the evening, and he'll like walk around the countryside and meet the people and write a few lines, come back in, have a nice meal and a glass of wine, get up the next morning, go down the road a little bit further to another little Holiday Inn type cottage hotel, where he'll do that. He can do that for 2 years. Okay, he can do that for 2 years. Why? Because he has bank, so he doesn't have to work, which allows him to be able to just kind of write in leisure and write his poetry. What is at the heart of Wordsworth's romanticism? Well, in a phrase, it's a revolt. It's a revolt. It's just like the revolution of Tommy and his pals in 1776, but it's a different kind of revolt than that. Best evidenced in his famous sonnet that will be published in Lyrical Balance, "The world is too much with us, late and soon." The world? Like Ruthie's tree? No, 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 not that world. What world is too much with us? We are consumed too much with what world? The world of the mall. You know, that wretched place where people go to... Some of us just loathe that experience. Wordsworth was one of them. Getting and spending the mall. Abercrombie. Remember? That's where I had you picture Socrates sitting at the fountain, where he asked the kid, why Gap? Why Abercrombie? Getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. We care more about what we wear. We care more about collecting money. We care more about what we drive. We care more about stuff than what? Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Uh-oh, look at the next line. I told you there's a reason why I had you memorize it. Little that we see in, and he capitalized it when he used the word, nature that is ours. Now later, these romantics will be called tree huggers. But the reality is this is a silly kind of title, and here's why. Look at my whiteboard. It's not a matter of Ruthie's tree. It's a matter of the nature and energy that Ruthie's tree represents. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. And then it comes, he pulls out the big bat. We've given our hearts away. Assorted, that doesn't mean good. Boon, that doesn't mean good. Now, we're not talking about those bad karate kung fu movies where somebody's heart gets torn out of their chest. He's speaking metaphorically. To give your heart away means you give up the one thing in your life that can matter to you. Well, what can matter? This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. The sea can look so calm. And then we know that the winds can come along and make that sea really rage. For this, for everything. For those of you who are into music, you can appreciate this line. We are out of tune. We're like a piano or a guitar that's just not tuned very well. Why not? Nature moves us not. We're incapable of realizing what truly matters. That is a fundamental romantic insight. Got me? Now, here's the point back to human nature. Humans are not inherently evil. It's not that we really want much. Give the option. A $100 bill to a 2-year-old or 5 pennies, and the 2-year-old will take the 5 pennies every time. Why? Because the 5-year-old doesn't have a clue about the value, correct? You got to be taught about why Abercrombie matters, about what malls are and why they matter. You don't instinctively want that stuff. What you want are the things that you can have for free. The joy of a pretty sunshiny day at the park when you're 5. That costs nothing. And yet somehow we seem to lose that. This will sound very much like our lectures on Thoreau and Emerson, won't it? I mean, now we're back to that transcendental idea that what truly matters, you already possess. You've just, it's a key romantic concept, forgotten. We've given our hearts away. A sordid boon. Wordsworth's insights will come to full fruition, however, in his most classical statement, Tintern Abbey. Now, to understand and to appreciate these lines, you got to have a little bit of background. Wordsworth had gone on a 5-year journey away from a special spot in southern Wales in England, where there's this beautiful cathedral. I'll show you pictures tomorrow. Beautiful cathedral called Tintern Abbey. It's no longer used. It was no longer used in 1800. It was already a dilapidated cathedral. And yet, it's this beautiful, pristine place. And Wordsworth is coming back. For your notes, important. Not alone. He comes back with his sister, Dorothy, who he very much is close with. She's young, he's old. And as Wordsworth comes back to Tintern Abbey, he has a powerful moment of reflection that he will write about in this poem. Not unlike the student of mine who swore once he graduated he was getting out of this hole of a town never to return again. He was going to emancipate himself first by going on a study abroad program, which he did. And he was gone, and then once he finished his study abroad program, he elected to just stay in Europe, where he lived for a few more years, working in any number of little humanitarian projects. Finally, 3 years later, he came back, and he landed in Denver. He had grown up all his life in Whirland, landed in Denver, and he started the drive north. And he said, reported to me in a conversation later, what a strange feeling it was coming north. He said, as I hit Casper, I started, because he was a ball player and he had done those trips over and over again of the travel. And he said, I started to have all these powerful recollections. And as I hit Thermop, he said, it was really powerful to me. All of the memories from my youth, because he hadn't been around for 3 years. But he said, as he got right outside of Whirland, he saw the smoke coming out of the Holly sugar, factory, and all of that. He came back in the winter. He said, immediately he was reminded of everything. And as he crossed, the Bighorn River outside of the edge of town, it was like all of those feelings, emotions, memories came back, and he said to me, it reminded me of the way Wordsworth talks about it at the beginning of Tintern Abbey, which is exactly what Wordsworth will say. Let's take a look at the poem. We'll exegete in more detail later. Let's just read the poem now, and this becomes one of the central poems in the history of the English poetic tradition, certainly the Sentinel Poem of the Romantic tradition. Follow with me. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and loose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. With some uncertain notice as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me, as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I've owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings, too, of unremembered pleasure, such perchance as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood, in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. That serene and blessed mood, in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporal frame and even the motion of our human blood, almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. While with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. If this be but a vain belief, yet, oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan, why thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee? And now, with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again, while here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love that had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. Not for this faint eye, nor mourn nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains and all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they have created and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. Nor, perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend. And in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. And this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege through all the joys of this our life to lead from joy to joy. For she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us or disturb our cheerful faith, that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore, let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies, oh then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me in these my exhortations? Nor perchance if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I so long a worshipper of nature hither came unwearied in that service, rather say with warmer love, with far deeper zeal of holier love. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. Now, for your notes as we finish, jot this down and we'll come back tomorrow to exegete. This is a poetic essay with a clearly articulated thesis and points of validation. We will want to read it as such. The poem has an identifiable movement from past to present to future, and we will want to identify that as well. We will begin tomorrow by pointing out, however, that this is what happens when mathematics meets poetry. That is to say, this is a Platonist rendering. So that the word forms, I did it intentionally when I put it on the board. The word forms is going to be used over and over again, right? These beauteous forms have not been to me as is the landscape to a blind man's eye, but often lonely rooms, and in the den of towns and cities I've owed to them sensation sweet, blah, blah, blah. We'll talk about it tomorrow and ask, what is romantic about this poem as we have defined romanticism? And then finally this question, what were you like when you were young? We'll come back to that one tomorrow. Thank you.